Now, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Hsien Loong, is to step down ahead of elections in 2025. Mr Lee, who's 71, will hand control of the ruling party, the PAP, to the Deputy Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, as soon as the party's 70th anniversary next November. Well, Adam Hancock is a Singapore-based journalist. Very good afternoon to you, Adam.
Hello, good afternoon.
So before we find out about Lawrence Wong, let's just briefly examine Mr Lee's legacy. It is one which lasts several decades, and the family connections are quite close, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the name Lee is just synonymous, really, with Singapore politics. It was Hsien Loong's father, Lee Kuan Yew, who many call the founder, really, of modern-day Singapore. He's the man who turned this small island into a huge success story. And really, Hsien Loong has kind of carried on that legacy, really. It will be 20 years next year that he will have been Singapore Prime Minister. He's done a lot to continue to grow the country as a huge international hub and a very attractive place to do business in his time in charge, particularly during the pandemic. A lot of companies moved their kind of Asia headquarters to Singapore. He's brought a lot of big events into the country as well. The Formula One race every year here. There was that very famous summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un that happened in Singapore as well. He'll be remembered for guiding the country through the pandemic, and Singapore got a lot of praise for how they handled the pandemic. But he won't be without criticism as well. His last election in 2020, it was a pretty poor performance by the standards of the PAP. He's had a very high-profile family feud with his brother, so he doesn't come without his criticism. But yeah, I think it's just really he'll be remembered as kind of carrying on that Lee dynasty in Singapore.
It is strange to think of Mr Lee in the past tense, but we do have to, because he's now handed, not just yet, but in the next year, the leadership of the party to Lawrence Wong, who, I mean, you mentioned the COVID crisis response. Singapore did have the reputation of having one of the world's lowest rates of illness and death during the early days of the pandemic, at least. And many have credited Lawrence Wong for this.
Yes, absolutely. He kind of came to prominence during that time. You know, he's been a civil servant and a politician for, I think it's around 25 years, but he really became the face of the kind of COVID-19 response. Very early on, they put together a task force, and he was one of the co-chairs of that COVID response organisation. And, you know, he was the face of the press conferences, delivering often bad news about restrictions and more restrictions that were going to come into play. But really, he was there throughout and a face that Singaporeans grew to recognise. And I think it was that performance, you know, it was notable during COVID that Hsien Loong took a bit of a back step and let the next generation of leaders take control of that situation and handle that crisis. And Lawrence Wong really shone through. And I think that is why he was chosen to be the next Prime Minister of the country, really. He's the leader of what they call here the fourth generation leaders, or the 4G leaders. And he was picked in 2022 to be the man who was going to kind of lead that group of leaders and effectively become the next Prime Minister. Everyone sort of knew when it was announced that he was going to be the next man. So people have had time to get used to him. You know, he's the Deputy Prime Minister as it stands. He's getting more and more public appearances. And as I said, he was kind of the face of the COVID response. So he is well known to Singaporeans now.
Adam Hancock, thank you so much for joining us on the line down from Singapore. You're listening to Monocle Radio.